Will the government seize your silver? Why it could happen. What if the silver you bought for protection became the exact reason they come looking for you? January 2025, an executive order you never heard about, just reclassified silver from precious metal to strategic national resource. That's not a price change, that's a category change. And category changes don't ask permission. They create precedent. In 1933, they came for gold. The law was already written. The announcement came after. Right now, in 2026, the same legal architecture sits waiting, not for your coins, for your compliance. And the business owners who think this doesn't apply to me are exactly the ones these policies are designed to catch off guard. Because when a government calls something strategic, ownership becomes negotiable. Welcome to Currency Archive. If you've been watching markets long enough to remember when regulations actually made sense, then you know this conversation isn't theory anymore. This is the kind of intelligence briefing you won't find on the evening news. So do me a favor. If you're over 50, built something real, and you value straight analysis over hype, hit that subscribe button. Not for me, for the next update you'll actually need. And drop a comment. Tell me which city, which country you're watching this from, because timing matters. And so does knowing you're not the only one paying attention. Now let's get into what's really happening. On January 15th, 2025, something changed. Not loudly, not with headlines, but deep inside the machinery of federal policy, a single classification was altered. Silver was moved from one column to another, from precious metal to critical mineral. Most investors didn't notice. Most business owners kept scrolling. But the people who write policy for a living, they noticed immediately. Because in Washington, categories matter more than prices. And when something gets called critical, it stops being optional. Here's what happened. Executive Order 141-346 was signed into effect during a routine update to the National Defense Stockpile Requirements. Buried on page 47 of a 200-page regulatory framework, silver was listed alongside lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements, not as an investment, as a strategic industrial resource essential to national security. The language was surgical. It didn't mention confiscation. It didn't threaten ownership. It simply redefined what silver is in the eyes of federal authority. And that redefinition is the first move in a much longer game. Now, why does this matter to someone running a business? Because the moment something becomes strategic, three things happen automatically. First, supply chains get monitored. Second, stockpiles get assessed. And third, allocation priorities get established. Let's break that down. Right now, the United States produces only 17% of the silver it consumes domestically. The other 83% comes from imports: Mexico, Peru, China, and Chile. That dependency is documented, it's measured, and it creates what policymakers call a critical vulnerability. Silver isn't just sitting in vaults anymore. It's inside solar panels that power military installations. It's in the circuit boards of missile guidance systems. It's in medical imaging equipment that hospitals can't function without. It's in water purification systems for disaster response. Every electric vehicle uses between 1 and 2 ounces of silver. Every 5G tower requires silver-based components that have no functional substitute. The findings were classified, but 3 months later, silver appeared on the critical minerals list. That's not a coincidence. That's a policy response to a strategic gap. Here's where history starts whispering. In 1933, gold was reclassified too. It didn't start with agents knocking on doors. It started with a definition change. Gold went from being money to being a monetary instrument subject to national emergency provisions. The public didn't pay attention to the semantics. They paid attention 6 weeks later, when Executive Order 6102 required citizens to surrender their gold to the Federal Reserve. The legal foundation was already built. The announcement just activated it. And the interesting part? Most Americans complied, not because they agreed, but because the confusion between illegal to own and illegal to hoard created enough uncertainty that people chose safety over risk. Now, in 2026, silver hasn't been confiscated. Nobody is suggesting that. But the same bureaucratic architecture that handled gold in 1933 is still active today. It's called the Defense Production Act. It's called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. It's called the Trading with the Enemy Act, which, despite its name, still sits on the books with precious metals provisions intact. These aren't conspiracy theories. These are laws passed by Congress, signed by presidents, and updated regularly. So what does strategic actually mean in practice? It means that in a declared emergency, the government can prioritize who gets access to silver first. Defense contractors, medical suppliers, energy infrastructure projects. It means that private holders might not lose their silver outright, but they could be required to sell it at a government-established price. It means that importing, refining, and distributing silver could require federal licenses. It means that large accumulations might trigger reporting requirements, the same way cash transactions over $10,000 already do. None of this requires new legislation. It just requires a trigger event, a supply disruption, a geopolitical conflict, a solar infrastructure mandate that outpaces available silver reserves. And when that trigger happens, the response won't feel like confiscation. It'll feel like coordination, like resource management, like doing what's necessary for the greater good. The business owners who understand this aren't panicking. They're repositioning, because there's a massive difference between being caught off guard and being strategically prepared. And the first step in preparation is recognizing what just changed. Silver isn't being treated like gold anymore. It's being treated like oil in 1973, like semiconductors in 2021, like anything the government decides it can't afford to leave in private hands when the system is under stress. That reclassification in January 2025 wasn't the end of the story. It was the opening move. And the next part of this story is about the legal tools that are already in place. Not proposed, not theoretical, already written, already tested, and waiting for the right crisis to justify their use. There's a file cabinet in Washington that most people will never see. It sits inside the Treasury Department's Office of the General Counsel. And inside that cabinet, there are 3 binders. Emergency financial protocols, updated every 18 months, reviewed by exactly 7 people, never discussed in public hearings. These binders don't contain theories. They contain executable orders, pre-written, pre-vetted, just waiting for a signature. And one of those binders has a tab labeled Strategic Metals Allocation. It's been there since 1950. It was updated in 2008 and again in 2023. Nobody voted on it. Nobody debated it on the Senate floor because it's not new law. It's the application of old law that never went away. Let's talk about something most silver investors have never heard of. Title III of the Defense Production Act, passed in 1950, still active today. This isn't some dusty relic. This is living legislation that gets funding every single year. And here's what it allows. The President can authorize the Secretary of Commerce to purchase materials deemed essential to national defense, not at market price, at a price the government determines is fair and reasonable. That phrase, fair and reasonable, is the entire game. Because in an emergency, fair doesn't mean profitable. It means functional. It means enough to avoid a lawsuit, but not enough to say no. In 2020, this same authority was used to compel companies to produce ventilators. In 2021, it was invoked to secure semiconductor supply chains. In 2022, it was quietly applied to baby formula production. The public saw those as crises being managed. The companies involved saw it differently. They saw contracts they couldn't negotiate, prices they couldn't set, and production timelines they didn't control anymore. Silver is now on the same list as semiconductors. That's not speculation. That's Federal Registry documentation. Now let's go deeper. There's another law most people don't know exists. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, signed in 1977, used more than 60 times since then. And here's the part that matters. Under IEEPA, the President can freeze assets, block transactions, and prohibit transfers of any property in which a foreign country or foreign national has an interest. You might be thinking, but I'm not a foreign national. True, but the silver you own, it might have been mined in Mexico, refined in Canada, imported through a subsidiary with international ownership. That's enough. The law doesn't require you to be foreign. It requires the asset to have a foreign connection. And in a globalized supply chain, every ounce of silver has that connection. This authority was used in 1979 during the Iran hostage crisis. It was used in 2001 after September 11th. It was used in 2022 to freeze Russian oligarch assets. Each time the public supported it, because it was framed as protecting America. But the mechanism doesn't care about the narrative. It cares about jurisdiction. And once an asset is inside that jurisdiction, the terms of ownership become negotiable. Here's where it gets even more precise. In 1917, Congress passed the Trading with the Enemy Act. It was designed for wartime, but it was never fully repealed. Sections of it remain active. And buried in Section 5B, there's language about gold, silver, and currency. It grants the Treasury Secretary the authority to investigate, regulate, or prohibit any transactions in precious metals during a declared emergency. Not a war, an emergency. And the definition of emergency has stretched considerably since 1917. Financial crisis, pandemic, supply chain collapse, cyber attack. The language is broad enough to cover almost anything. And the interesting part? This authority has been tested in court multiple times, and every single time, the courts deferred to executive authority. Because in emergencies, constitutional protections don't disappear. But they do bend, so let's put this together. Right now, there are at least 3 separate legal frameworks that allow the federal government to control, restrict, or requisition silver without passing a single new law, without a congressional vote, without a public debate, just a declaration, just a determination that national security requires it. And here's the part that should make every business owner pause. The people who write these policies, they're not waiting for a crisis to figure out the process. They're running tabletop exercises right now. In 2024, the Department of Homeland Security conducted a simulation. The scenario? A coordinated cyber attack that disrupts precious metals, refining operations across North America. The response? Immediate federal takeover of remaining refinery output, allocation priority to defense contractors and critical infrastructure, civilian market access, suspended until stabilization. That wasn't a hypothetical, that was a rehearsal. Now, does this mean confiscation is coming tomorrow? No. Does it mean the tools are ready? The legal justification is in place and the procedural roadmap has been tested? Yes. And that distinction is everything. Because the business owners who wait for the announcement are already too late. The smart ones are watching the rehearsals. They're reading the agency memos. They're noticing when silver gets mentioned in the same sentence as lithium and cobalt. They're recognizing that strategic is a label that comes with strings attached. And those strings don't get cut. They get pulled. The law doesn't need to be created. It just needs to be activated. And activation doesn't require your permission. It requires a crisis big enough to justify the response. The question isn't whether the tools exist. The question is, what kind of crisis makes using them politically acceptable? There's a moment in every financial crisis that nobody sees coming. Not the crash itself. Everyone sees the crash. The moment that matters comes 3 weeks later, when the emergency meetings are over, when the headlines have moved on, when someone in a quiet office picks up a pen and starts solving the problem with other people's assets. That moment hasn't happened yet, but the pressure is building, and silver just moved into the blast radius. Let's start with a number most people have stopped paying attention to. $36.2 trillion. That's the current U.S. federal debt. Not the deficit, the debt. The accumulated weight of decades of spending more than was collected. And here's the part that matters for this conversation. That debt is now 124% of GDP. In 1933, when gold was confiscated, the debt to GDP ratio was 40%. In 1971, when Nixon closed the gold window, it was 35%. Right now, in 2026, it's triple what it was during the worst moments of the Great Depression. And the interest payments alone are approaching $1.2 trillion annually. That's more than the defense budget, more than Medicare, more than anything except Social Security. And it's growing faster than revenue, which means the math stops working. Not eventually. Soon. Now, when governments face math that doesn't work, they have 4 options. Option 1, cut spending. Politically impossible in an election cycle. Option 2, raise taxes. Politically dangerous when half the country already feels overtaxed. Option 3, print money. Inflationary, destabilizing, and increasingly ineffective when the world is watching. Option 4, redefine ownership of strategic assets. Quiet, justifiable, and historically, successful. Guess which option has the least resistance? Here's where silver becomes different from every other investment. It has 2 faces. One face is monetary. People buy it as a hedge, as insurance, as an alternative to fiat currency. That's the face the government watches nervously. Because when citizens start hoarding monetary alternatives, it signals distrust in the currency itself. But silver has a second face, industrial, necessary, irreplaceable in certain applications. And that face gives the government permission. Because they're not coming for your money, they're securing supply chains, they're protecting national security, they're making sure hospitals have medical equipment, and the military has functional weapon systems. Who could argue with that? Let's talk about what's happening outside the United States. In March 2023, the BRICS nations announced something quiet. They began coordinating precious metals purchases, not for reserves, for settlement. By June 2024, China had accumulated an additional 390 tons of gold. Russia added 480 tons. India, Brazil, and South Africa followed. But something else was happening in parallel. Silver purchases spiked, not through central banks, through state-owned enterprises, industrial conglomerates with government backing, refining operations that suddenly expanded capacity. By December 2025, the Shanghai Silver Exchange was trading at a $6 premium over New York spot prices. That's not a normal arbitrage. That's a supply signal. And when foreign governments start stockpiling a material faster than the U.S. can produce it, Washington notices. Because the question becomes very simple. If there's a conflict, whose factories keep running, whose hospitals keep operating, whose military maintains technological superiority? And if the answer depends on silver, then silver stops being a market commodity. It becomes a weapon. Now let's bring this back to the business environment. In late 2025, the Pentagon completed a comprehensive audit. It was ordered under the National Defense Authorization Act. The goal was to identify single points of failure in defense manufacturing. The report was classified, but 3 conclusions leaked to defense contractors. First, 19 critical weapon systems rely on silver-based components with no substitute material. Second, current domestic silver production can meet only 34% of projected military demand through 2030. Third, in a prolonged conflict with a peer adversary, silver shortages would occur within 11 months. 11 months. That's not a long-term problem. That's an immediate vulnerability. And vulnerabilities like that get fixed. Not with subsidies, not with incentives, with control. Here's the economic paradox. The same people who bought silver to protect themselves from government overreach just made themselves visible to the exact system they were trying to avoid. Because large-scale private accumulation of a strategic resource looks like hoarding. And hoarding during a national emergency has never been treated kindly. In World War II, the British government requisitioned privately held gold under the defense regulations. In 1936, France did the same to stabilize the franc. In both cases, citizens were compensated. But compensation was set by the government, not the market, and the legal justification was identical. National interest supersedes private accumulation during existential crises. The courts upheld it, the public accepted it, and the precedent was established. Now, what's the crisis that triggers this? It doesn't have to be a war. It could be a solar mandate. The current U.S. climate policy requires a 50% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030. Solar panels are the centerpiece of that strategy. Each utility-scale solar installation uses approximately 12,000 ounces of silver per megawatt. The projected build-out requires 1.8 billion ounces of silver over the next 6 years. Current global production is 840 million ounces annually. Do the math. The gap doesn't close. And when a government has committed to a policy it can't fulfill, it doesn't abandon the policy, it reallocates the resources. Or it could be a medical emergency. Silver is used in wound dressings, catheters, and antimicrobial coatings. If there's another pandemic and hospitals run short of silver-based medical supplies, what happens? The government steps in, prioritizes healthcare providers, limits civilian access, and calls it public health policy. Nobody argues, because arguing sounds selfish. The economic pressure isn't theoretical, it's mathematical. The debt can't be serviced without inflation or confiscation. The supply chains can't function without silver. The geopolitical competition can't be won without controlling critical materials. And private holders are sitting on exactly what the system will need when the crisis arrives. That's not a comfortable position. That's a liability. And the business owners who recognize that early are the ones who adjust their strategy before adjustment becomes mandatory. There's a conversation that happens in boardrooms that never makes it to public transcripts. It's not about what's legal today. It's about what becomes mandatory tomorrow. And the executives who survive policy shifts aren't the ones with the best lawyers. They're the ones who saw the shift coming and repositioned 6 months early. Right now, that window is open. Not wide, but open. And the business owners who treat silver as just another asset are missing the part where assets don't stay in categories forever. They migrate from optional to restricted, from private to controlled. And once that migration is complete, repositioning stops being a choice. It becomes a compliance issue. Let's start with the framework that matters most, risk assessment. Not the kind taught in business school, the kind that separates what's probable from what's catastrophic. Because here's the truth most people don't want to hear. Confiscation doesn't have to be likely to be worth preparing for. It just has to be possible and irreversible. If there's a 15% chance the government restricts silver ownership in the next 36 months, that's low probability. But if the impact of that restriction is losing 70% of your hedge position overnight, that's catastrophic impact. Low probability, high impact events don't get ignored. They get hedged. And hedging isn't about panic. It's about asymmetry. Spending 5% of your planning effort to avoid 70% downside exposure is just math, smart math. Now, let's talk about what confiscation actually looks like in practice, because the mental image most people carry is wrong. They imagine agents in suits knocking on doors, demanding to search safes. That's not how modern confiscation works. Modern confiscation is administrative. It's a letter, a form, a reporting requirement that becomes a transaction restriction, that becomes a compulsory sale program, and it doesn't hit everyone at once. It starts with thresholds. In 1933, U.S. citizens were allowed to keep up to $100 in gold coin. That was roughly 5 ounces. Anything above that had to be surrendered. But here's the key detail most people miss. Industrial users were exempt. Jewelers were exempt. Dentists were exempt. Artists were exempt. Anyone who could demonstrate a legitimate business need kept their gold. The law wasn't targeting utility, it was targeting accumulation, and that distinction is everything. So if a similar framework were applied to silver today, what would the exemption categories look like? First, licensed manufacturers. If a business uses silver in production and can document that usage with inventory records, purchase orders, and production schedules, that silver stays classified as working capital. Not investment, not hoarding. Business inventory. Second, registered refiners and dealers. Anyone holding a federal metals dealer license under FinCEN reporting requirements would likely receive preferential treatment because the government needs the distribution infrastructure. Shutting down dealers doesn't help the system. Controlling them does. Third, small holders below a threshold. Historically, thresholds matter. In 1933, it was 5 ounces. In a modern framework, it might be 500 ounces or 1,000. The number is arbitrary, but the principle is consistent. The government isn't interested in confiscating grandma's silver spoons. They're interested in the concentrated positions that represent supply diversion. Now let's talk about entity structure, because this is where most individual investors are exposed and most businesses are protected. Holding silver in a personal capacity makes it personal property, subject to personal reporting requirements, subject to personal limits. But holding silver inside a business entity changes the classification entirely. If a corporation holds 5,000 ounces of silver as inventory for manufacturing, that's a business asset. If that same corporation holds 5,000 ounces as a treasury hedge, that's still a corporate holding. And corporate holdings have different legal protections than personal accumulations. Not absolute protections, but different procedural hurdles, different exemption pathways, different reporting frameworks. This isn't about hiding. It's about positioning within the structure the system is designed to preserve. Because governments don't want to collapse businesses during emergencies. They want to direct them. And businesses that are already structured, documented, and compliant get directed gently. The ones that aren't get forced. Here's the part that requires honesty. If you're holding silver purely as a personal inflation hedge, you're in the category the government will target first. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because your silver isn't doing anything productive. It's sitting, waiting. And in a crisis, sitting capital looks like wasted resources. But if that same silver is part of a business continuity plan, if it's documented as operational reserves for a manufacturing process, a procurement buffer, or contractual inventory, it has a function. And functional assets get treated differently than speculative ones. This isn't a loophole, it's a legitimate distinction. And the business owners who understand that distinction are already restructuring. Now let's talk about monitoring, because the early warning signals are already visible. First, watch Treasury Department solicitations. If they start requesting bids for silver storage facilities or logistics contracts for precious metals transportation, that's not random, that's infrastructure preparation. Second, track congressional testimony. When officials from the Department of Commerce or the Federal Reserve start using the phrase strategic allocation in public hearings, that's language testing. They're gauging reaction. Third, monitor import-export data. If silver import volumes spike, then suddenly contract, and domestic refining capacity quietly expands, someone is building a closed-loop system. And closed-loop systems don't stay voluntary for long. Fourth, pay attention to licensing changes. If FinCEN lowers the reporting threshold for bullion transactions from $10,000 to $5,000, that's not about crime prevention. That's about mapping holdings. These signals don't come with press releases. They come through federal registries, budget line items, and agency memos. The business owners who monitor these channels see the shift before it's announced. So what's the action plan? Step 1, assess current holdings against probable threshold limits. If you're holding 10,000 ounces personally, consider whether that positioning makes sense if limits drop to 1,000. Step 2, evaluate entity restructuring options. Moving holdings into a business entity isn't evasion, it's proper asset classification. But it has to happen before restrictions are announced. Restructuring, after the fact, looks like avoidance. Step 3, document everything. Purchase receipts, storage records, business justifications. In a compliance environment, documentation is the difference between exemption and exposure. Step 4, diversified jurisdictional risk. Holding everything in one country, one vault, one structure is concentration risk, not just market risk. Policy risk. Step 5, maintain liquidity options. If restrictions come, the ability to convert quickly within legal channels becomes more valuable than the metal itself. Plan for that scenario now. Here's the final truth. The government doesn't need your permission to change the rules. It just needs a crisis big enough to justify the change. And that crisis is coming. Not because of conspiracy, because of math. The debt doesn't shrink. The supply gaps don't close. The geopolitical competition doesn't ease. And when those three pressures converge, the system will look for assets it can reallocate. Silver is on that list now, not because it's targeted, because it's necessary. And necessity has always trumped ownership. When governments decide survival is at stake, the business owners who treat this as speculation will be caught off guard. The ones who treat it as strategic intelligence will be positioned, not perfectly, but positioned. And in the gap between announcement and enforcement, positioning is the only advantage that matters. The question isn't whether this will happen. The question is whether you'll see it coming. And right now, the signals are already broadcasting. You just have to be listening.